Chapter 31. Studio. Nick Cobb stood at a mirror in his dressing room. The windowless space had a pastel pink sofa straight out of 1985, and shiny black marks trodden into the ragged carpet. Cobb could remember when all this stuff was new, and, depressingly, the mirror seemed to indicate that he'd aged no better than the furniture. He'd come a long way since those first TV appearances at Tyneside Studios, standing in for the resident chef on a long-forgotten magazine show. He now owned 8 restaurants, had 11 best-selling cookery books under his belt, hosted the longest-running cookery show on United States television, and owned a major stake in the Gourmet Network satellite channel. Cobb strolled across to the drinks cabinet and thought about a shot of vodka. But it was 10 in the morning, and he couldn't face the dusty bottles and fingerprint-smudged glassware. His publicist, Amanda, knocked on the door and stepped in without awaiting an answer. He was about to ask why they'd agreed to come back to this dump when a set of grey tyres inched into the room. The kid in the wheelchair was 13, with twigs for arms and metal braces on her legs. He'd heard her sob story, but could only remember that he'd been too tired to argue when he'd agreed to let her visit the dressing room. "Hello there, young lass," Cobb said, turning on the charm with an accent pitched awkwardly between Tyneside and California. "You must be Gaynor." The girl smiled and said something, or rather gargled, because of the breathing tube sticking out of her throat. Fortunately, Gaynor's mother could translate. "She's baked you cakes," the mum explained, as she reached into a basket beneath the wheelchair and picked out an airtight box. Gaynor was weak, and it took her half a minute to peel the lid off. Cobb eased the silence by asking his publicist to fetch a pot of tea. "Clean china cups," he added, instantly wondering if the demand made him sound like the kind of celebrity prick he was always telling himself he hadn't become. Cobb took one of the little sponge cakes out of the box and bit it, expecting the worst. "That is one fantastic bit of sponge cake," he beamed. And Cobb wasn't lying. The cake got everything right. Fluffy without being too dry, and just enough vanilla to stop it from being dull. But once he'd commented on the cake, he couldn't think what else to say, and the perfect sponge somehow made the presence of the grinning Gaynor even more dismal. He'd seen more than his share of dying kids over the years, but still felt as uncomfortable as when he'd encountered the first, 18 years earlier. What were you supposed to say? "Hey, Johnny, how's the whole dying of cancer thing coming along?" But ignoring the presence of death and talking about something else seemed impossibly awkward. Like taking a swim while trying to ignore an alligator at the other end of the pool. "So," Nick said, sucking air through his teeth as he helped himself to another magnificent cake. "Did you come here by car? Was the traffic okay?" Then he glanced at his $16,000 Patek watch and wished that Amanda, a master of small talk, would hurry back with the tea. After an edgy night, sleeping on bare boards, James had been woken up at 5 a.m. Kyle helped him dye his hair brown and spike it up with gel, while they discussed the possibility of ambushing the AFA operation before it got underway. But there were 11 AFA members, several of whom carried guns. The 2 cherubs had no idea where they were and no way of communicating with the outside world. They decided to play along with the operation and hope that an opportunity arose to stop it before anyone was seriously hurt. After another hour stuffed in the windowless rear compartment of a van, James ended up in the front row of the studio audience, getting slowly cooked by the lights hanging over his head. Mark and Adelaide sat on either side of him. The AFA had taken every reasonable step to make James unrecognisable. His usual tracksuit and football shirt was replaced with a punkish look. Tatty black boots, drainpipe jeans with rips over the knees, and black hoodie with the Ramones written across the back. Mark and Adelaide had received a similar makeover for the benefit of live TV. Nick Cobb grinned at the cameras from a smart blue couch, while husband and wife presenters Wendy and Otis Fox fed him easy-to-answer questions. The excitable audience lapped up every word from the local lad made good. "So, Nick," Wendy Fox grinned, as James marvelled at the quantity of makeup plastered over her face. "You've written this mammoth biography. 856 pages of it. Why did you feel that now was the right time in your life to do it?" Nick smiled yet again. "I've sold a lot of cookery books, and I've had publishers chasing after me to write an autobiography for many years. But when I first spoke with my co-author, Penny Marshall, I realised that I'd finally met a person with the talent to help me get my life down on the page." "Well, it is an absolutely fascinating read," Wendy Fox grinned. "Now, I understand that the proceeds from the book are going to charity?" "Absolutely," Cobb nodded. "I hit 50 a couple of years back. The wives have all left me, and my boys are at college, so I decided it was time to work on something other than my own bank balance. The royalties from sales of Word on the Cob are going to support a basket of organisations, including Oxfam, the Red Cross, and the Chef's Trust. That's a local charity here on Tyneside that runs a catering school for underprivileged youngsters." Cobb lapped up a round of applause as James's watch ticked over to 11:54. James pushed his sunglasses up his nose, pulled his hoodie over his head, and drew on the string to tighten it around his face. At the same instant, Adelaide and Mark were going for the guns hidden inside their jackets. "Nobody move!" Adelaide screamed, pulling her gun as she leapt out of her seat. There was an air of disbelief amongst the audience. A student prank, maybe? But Mark cleared away the doubts by shooting at the ceiling. The round tore through one of the giant lamps on the overhead gantry. Members of the audience screamed beneath a shower of hot glass as James and Adelaide charged onto the stage. "I need your radio mic," Adelaide demanded as she waved her gun at Wendy Fox. James took the little microphone from Wendy and clipped it to Adelaide's bomber jacket. I'm sorry to interrupt your daytime viewing," Adelaide said, her voice trembling. "But the Animal Freedom Army will not stand by while men like Nick Cobb make millions of pounds through the enslavement and torture of animals." While Adelaide unfurled a banner with the Animal Freedom Army's web address on it, James stepped up to the astonished Nick Cobb and ripped a set of handcuffs out of his jeans. "Show us your wrists." Cobb grinned dumbly, unwilling to comprehend the gravity of his situation as Otis Fox made a clumsy lunge at James. Unfortunately, the closest the tubby presenter had come to exercising in the past decade was a stroll on the golf course, and James dodged easily, before coming back with the handcuffs bunched in his fist and smashing them into the bridge of the presenter's nose. Wendy Fox made a pig-like squeal as Otis crashed off the end of the sofa with blood streaming down his face. "Don't mess us about," James ordered. "Anyone pulls a stunt like that, I'll shoot a member of the audience," Mark yelled, swinging his gun around so that it pointed at Gaynor's wheelchair in the front row. The audience was eerily quiet, apart from the sobs of a woman burned by the falling glass. Cobb finally held out his wrists so that James could fit the blood-spattered handcuffs as Mark stepped back from the audience and pointed his gun towards the cameraman nearest the studio exit. "Open it up." James told Cobb to start walking as daylight broke into the studio. He was the last to step out into a drizzly morning and set off at a run across a parking lot towards 2 Honda touring bikes. Mark opened up the pannier on the back of the nearest motorbike and tossed James a crash helmet and riding gloves. Adelaide buckled up her helmet and locked her gun away before planting a helmet on Cobb. "I can't shoot and ride," Mark said as he handed his gun to James. "Safety's off." With the gun in his hands, James had the power to free Cobb, but Kyle was with Joe, and he reckoned she'd shoot him if he betrayed the AFA. "How am I supposed to hold on?" Cobb protested, jangling his cuffs. Adelaide realised that this was a glitch in the AFA's carefully laid plan. She grabbed a small key out of her jeans and undid the cuffs before pointing at James. "Try any funny stuff, and the boy will shoot you." A couple of studio employees had ventured out onto the first floor fire escape, and one of them filmed bravely with a camcorder. James waved the gun at them before jumping on the thickly padded rear seat of the giant bike and locking his arms around Mark's waist. "All set," James said. Adelaide and Nick roared off first. She hit 60 miles an hour on the slip road out of the lot before taking a quick glance over her shoulder and surging onto a lightly trafficked section of dual carriageway. James had ridden dirt bikes across tracks in Idaho, but he'd never experienced a bike at high speed. The AFA had deliberately provided tight clothes, but even on a touring bike with a big screen to prevent buffeting, his trousers flapped like crazy and he struggled to breathe as the 2 Hondas doubled the 60-mile-per-hour speed limit. The bikes kept in close formation as James glanced back for any sign of a police car. According to Joe's plan, the nearest station was 15 minutes away, but you could never be certain that there wasn't a patrol car somewhere closer. Dodging between traffic, with the wind rushing and the blur of tarmac a few centimetres from his boot, was one of the most frightening experiences of James's life. He wasn't wearing properly padded motorcycle leathers and had no idea how much experience Mark had of riding a heavy bike on a damp road. He tried not to remember the horrific images of skin grafts and shattered bones he'd seen in his motorbike magazines, but they kept popping into his head as the sweat drizzled inside his helmet. Mercifully, the trip was short. Mark and Adelaide covered 8 miles in under 5 minutes before pulling off for a final stretch at saner speeds, shooting along a deserted side road past boarded-up warehouses. They ended up at an abandoned container terminal on the edge of the River Tyne. 2 vans and 2 cars awaited them. One van had its rear doors open, with Joe and Kyle sitting on the ledge. Kyle slid out a metal ramp and the passengers climbed off the bikes before the riders drove them inside and cut the engines. The helmets and riding gloves were tossed in after the bikes, then Kyle and James turned the metal ramp onto its edge and shoved it noisily back inside. Joe pointed her gun at Cobb and ordered him to walk towards a blue van parked 20 metres away. James checked nobody was within earshot before whispering to Kyle, "I've got Mark's gun. Do you reckon we can take them down?" "Not a chance," Kyle said, shaking his head. "Joe's got a gun, so's Adelaide. There's another guy with a gun in the van around the corner. Tom's up on the roof keeping lookout." "Shit," James muttered. "Even if we could pull that off, it'd be a bloodbath." A police helicopter blasted overhead. Everyone looked up in shock, but it was flying high and fast, probably heading towards Tyneside Studios. Mark was walking towards the boys. "Heart missed a beat there," he grinned, as Kyle slammed the van doors. "Are you driving this one, Kyle?" James asked. Kyle nodded before pulling James into a hug. "See you, dude." "Keep safe," James said, as he felt Kyle slip a piece of paper into his pocket. A blue van with Joe at the wheel and Nick Cobb handcuffed in the back roared past, with spray shooting off its back wheels. Mark jangled a set of car keys in front of James. "Better shift," he said. "Adelaide's changed already. We need to get to the safe house." As Kyle stepped into the driver's seat of the van with the motorbikes in the back, James and Mark strode briskly towards a small Renault parked around the corner. Adelaide gave a quick wave as she skimmed past in a Mini. Tom had jumped off the roof as soon as he'd seen the hostage leave, and Kyle drove away with him a few seconds later. Mark opened the back door of the Renault. He kicked off his shoes and began a quick change into a tracksuit and white canvas pumps. James stripped off his punk gear, revealing a white Nike tennis shirt with blue shorts underneath, then took a pair of white trainers out of a bag containing rackets and balls on the back seat of the car. The clothes, shoes, and sunglasses they'd used in the raid were all stuffed into a black bin liner that would be incinerated later. Mark told James to zip the handcuff inside a plastic case covering a tennis racket. James glanced at his watch again as they pulled out of the dockyard. 12:07. 13 minutes earlier, they were masked punks waving guns around in a TV studio. Now they had different wheels and looked like a father and son heading off for a knockabout on the local courts.